My name is Renee Calloway, I'm 34 years old, and the last time my mother touched me, she was pressing a folded 20 and 2 tens into my palm to prove a point. That's $50, Donna Pruitt said, loud enough for the caterers to stop pouring champagne. That's what you were worth to us. Don't stand there in that fancy coat acting like you were ever worth more. We were standing under the white tent outside the new Callaway Industries riverfront tower, 300 people in cocktail attire around us, string quartet mid-song, my name on a banner 20 feet tall. I had a chipped ceramic mug in my other hand. I'd carried it out of habit, the way you carry a rosary, and I set it down on the linen tablecloth very carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to break by accident, because you're saving the breaking for later, on purpose. Okay, I said. She didn't know that in 6 days, I would be the one signing her family's name off every document that connected us. She didn't know the man in rags she sold me to for that $50 had, 3 weeks earlier, quietly made me the sole trustee of the largest privately held company in the state. She didn't know any of that yet. So let me tell you how I got here. I was 8 years old the day my parents sold me, and I want to be precise about the word sold, because for years I tried to soften it into something else. Gave away, handed off, let go of, and none of those are true. Ray and Donna Pruitt sold me. There was a transaction. There was an amount. There was a man. We lived outside Cleveland then, in a rental house on Fenmore Street with a porch that sagged on one side, and my father had lost his job at the plant that spring, and my mother had a way of disappearing into the bedroom for days that I later understood had a name. Money left the house faster than it came in. I remember my father sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee can full of change, counting it 3 times like the third count might be different from the first 2. The man came to our door on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because it was garbage day and the cans were still out at the curb, and he had to step around them. He was wearing a canvas coat the color of wet cardboard, patched at both elbows, and boots that had been resoled so many times the stitching looked like scar tissue. He had a gray beard he hadn't shaped in a while and eyes that moved slowly, like he was reading a room instead of looking at it. He said his name was Walton. Just Walton. No last name, not that day. I was sitting on the stairs in a yellow dress with a grease stain on the collar. My school dress, the only one that still fit, and I watched my father let him into the kitchen, and I watched my mother pour him coffee in the mug with the chipped rim, the one nobody else wanted, and I listened to the 3 of them talk for 11 minutes. I counted, because counting things was already a habit of mine by then. Numbers didn't change their minds about you. I didn't hear all of it. I heard my father say the word, temporary. I heard my mother say the word, better off. And at the end, I heard the sound of a bill being unfolded, and Walton saying, in a voice that wasn't unkind but also wasn't asking permission, "50's what I've got on me. 50's what she's worth to you today, I guess. Pack her a bag." Nobody explained it to me the way you'd want a grown adult to explain something like that to a child. My mother packed my bag herself. 2 dresses, a coat, my hairbrush, a paperback with the cover torn off, and she zipped it and set it by the door like she was checking a task off a list. My father didn't look at me when I walked past him. Walton held the screen door open with one boot and said, "You ready, kid?" Like we were headed to the store. I didn't cry until we were 4 blocks away, in his truck, which smelled like sawdust and coffee grounds. He didn't tell me to stop. He just drove with both hands on the wheel and let me finish, and when I was done he said, "All right," like that was that, and we didn't discuss it again for 11 years. I want to tell you what kind of man Walton Calloway turned out to be, because it matters for everything that comes after, but I want to tell it to you the way I learned it, slowly, and mostly by accident. He lived alone in a narrow house on the west side, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a table for 2, no television. He worked with his hands, that was what I believed for the first several years, that he did odd construction jobs around the city, because that was what his clothes said and that was what his hands said, calloused and thick-knuckled. He drove the same gray Ford truck for the entire time I knew him. He wore the same canvas coat, or one just like it, through 11 winters. But there were things that didn't fit, if you were paying attention, and I was always paying attention. There was the morning at the hardware store on Lorraine Avenue when the man behind the counter came around from behind the register just to shake his hand and called him Mr. Calloway, with a kind of care in his voice that you don't use on a man buying $2 of wood screws. Walton just said, "Don't start that," and bought his screws and left. There was the black car that idled outside our house sometimes, late, with a driver in a suit who never got out, and Walton would go stand at the passenger window for a few minutes in his canvas coat, talking low, and then wave the car off like he was shooing a fly. There was the lining of that coat. I found it once, hemming a tear for him at the kitchen table when I was maybe 12, needle and thread the way he taught me. He believed a person should know how to fix her own clothes, and stitched into the inside seam, small, in gold thread gone dull with age, were 2 letters, WC. I asked him what it meant. "Somebody who loved me stitched that in a long time ago," he said, and took the coat back before I could ask who. And there was the ritual, which is the thing I want you to remember, because it comes back around. Every morning, 5 a.m. before the sun, Walton made coffee in a percolator that hissed like a kettle, and he poured 2 cups. His in a plain white mug, mine in the chipped one, the one that had been on our kitchen table on Fenmore Street the day he bought me, because he'd asked my mother if he could take it. 2, and she'd let him, probably glad to have 1 less dish to wash. We'd sit at that 2-person table while the house was still dark, and he'd unroll a set of blueprints, real ones, building plans, sometimes for houses, sometimes for things too big to be houses, and he'd teach me how to read them. Load-bearing walls. Tolerances. Where a structure wants to fail and how you stop it from wanting that. "Everything's got a weak point," he told me once, tapping a pencil against a beam in a drawing. "Question is whether you find it before somebody else does." I didn't know at 12 that I was being trained. I thought it was just what we did together, the way other families watched television together. By the time I understood it was an education, I already loved it too much to call it anything else. He paid for my schooling without ceremony, never private school, never anything that would have made us stand out, just steady tuition checks written from an account I never saw the balance of. Community college first because he said debt was a weak point too, then a transfer to Ohio State for structural engineering, where I worked 2 jobs the whole time because he believed, fiercely, that a person should carry some of her own weight even when she didn't have to carry all of it. I waited tables Friday and Saturday nights. I graded homework for the statics professor. I came home on breaks and made his coffee in the mug with the chipped rim and unrolled blueprints with him at the same 2-person table, and by then I was correcting his math sometimes, and he'd grin like that was the whole point of the exercise. There were other things he taught me that had nothing to do with buildings, though I didn't separate them at the time. He taught me to balance a checkbook to the penny before I was allowed a bank card of my own. He taught me to read a contract twice, once for what it said, once for what it didn't say. After I came home at 16 excited about a part-time babysitting arrangement that turned out to pay half of what I'd been promised, because I hadn't asked for anything in writing. He never once said, "I told you so." He just sat with me at the kitchen table while I redid the math on what I was owed, and he drove me back to that family's house himself, and waited in the truck while I collected it. He was not an easy man, and I don't want to make him sound like a saint, because he wasn't one. He could go quiet for days over things I never fully understood. I think now it was grief for his wife, resurfacing on anniversaries he never named out loud, and he had a temper about wasted things, food thrown out, tools left in the rain, that I learned to work around rather than argue with. He missed my high school graduation because he'd forgotten what week it fell on, and showed up 2 hours late with a toolbox-shaped gift box that turned out to be a drafting set. And I was furious at him for exactly 1 evening before I understood that the drafting set was the apology, more honest than words would have been. That was Walton. He didn't perform love. He built things with it instead, and expected you to recognize the structure. I worked through most of my adolescence without quite framing it as a sacrifice, because it didn't feel like one from inside it. It felt like the ordinary shape of my life. 2 jobs through college, like I said, but also years before that. A paper route at 11 that I kept until I could drive, folding and rubber banding papers on the porch steps at 5:30 in the morning, right after our coffee, so the 2 habits fused into 1 hour of my day that I still associate, all these years later, with a very specific kind of peace. I skipped my senior prom to work a double shift covering for a coworker whose kid was sick, and I remember Walton offering to pay me the difference so I could go anyway, and I remember refusing, because by then his lesson about carrying your own weight had become mine, not just his. I got my PE license at 26, after failing the structural exam once at 24 and spending 8 months reteaching myself statics from the same blueprints Walton and I had unrolled at that table when I was 12, until the failure stopped feeling like a verdict and started feeling like a weak point I could reinforce. I started my own small structural firm at 28, 3 employees in a rented office above a dry cleaner, doing seismic retrofits and foundation work nobody glamorous wanted. The unglamorous work that taught me more about a building's real condition than any ribbon-cutting job ever would. I built it slow, the way Walton had taught me to build everything. One sound decision at a time, nothing borrowed that couldn't be repaid, nothing signed without reading it twice. I want to be honest that for a long time, I didn't think about Ray and Donna Pruitt at all. Or I told myself I didn't. Grief has a way of looking like indifference from the outside, and I'd gotten very good at wearing indifference like a coat of my own. Then, when I was 29, they found me. It was a Sunday, and I was at the little firm office catching up on drawings, and my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a Cleveland area code, and some old, stupid, hopeful thing in my chest, made me answer it. "Renee," my mother's voice said. "Renee, honey, is that you?" I didn't say anything for a second. I remember setting my pencil down flat on the drafting table, very precisely, parallel to the edge. "It's me," I said. She cried. She said she'd thought about me every day. She said losing me had broken something in her that never healed, that the drinking and my father's temper back then had made her do things no mother should ever do, that she'd gotten sober 4 years now, that my father had too, that they'd looked for me for years but hadn't known where Walton had taken me, that a cousin had finally spotted my name on a permit filing with the city and put it together. I believed her. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters that I wasn't a fool, or wasn't only a fool. I believed her because 21 years is a long time to hold a grudge against people you were built, biologically, to love, and because I wanted, badly, the way you want water when you're thirsty and you don't examine the glass too closely, for it to be true. We met for coffee. Then dinner. Then Sunday dinners, regular, at their place in Palmer, a small clean rental, nothing fancy, my father working steady at a warehouse, my mother doing books for a dry cleaner 2 blocks from her own house, which she thought was funny, given where my firm's office was. They came to the small ribbon cutting when I finished my first city contract, a bridge retrofit downtown, and my mother cried again and told the local reporter covering it that she'd always known I'd do something important, and I stood there in a hard hat and let her say it, because it felt, for a few months, like maybe it could just be a normal, ordinary, unremarkable good thing. A family repaired. For a while, it really did feel that way. My mother learned my coffee order, black, no sugar, a habit I'd picked up from Walton without meaning to, and started keeping a bag of the right beans in her cupboard for when I visited. My father, who'd said maybe 6 words to me the day I left Fenmore Street, started calling on Wednesday evenings just to talk about nothing, the Guardian's bullpen, a leak under his kitchen sink he was fixing himself, the kind of small talk that only means something because of how ordinary it's pretending to be. I let myself believe that this was just what it looked like when 2 people who'd made a terrible decision at the bottom of a terrible year spent 2 decades regretting it and finally got the chance to say so. I brought them, once, to meet Faye, at a lunch that went fine on its surface and that Faye described to me afterward, carefully, as interesting. I asked her what she meant and she wouldn't quite say, not yet, just that she'd watched my mother's eyes go to the check for the whole meal every time it came up in conversation, the way some people's eyes go to a door they're timing an exit through. I didn't want to hear it. I told her she was being protective, which she was, and that it wasn't a crime, which it wasn't, and we let it sit there between us for a few months longer than either of us was comfortable with. Walton didn't come to that ribbon cutting. When I told him about the Pruitts, at our 5 a.m. table, he listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and then he said, "People don't usually change what they are. They change what they need from you." He didn't tell me to stop seeing them. He just kept pouring 2 cups of coffee every morning instead of asking me to make it 4, and I understood, even then, that he was leaving room for me to find out on my own, because he thought that was the only way it would actually stick. He was right, of course. It took about 8 months. The first time my father asked for money, it was framed as an emergency. A truck repair, $300, paid back within the month, and it was, on time, to the dollar, which made the second ask, 5 months later, feel safe. $600, for a medical bill. Then it stopped being emergencies and started being requests with softer edges. If you've got it lying around, just to tide us over. I told myself this was ordinary, that families lent each other money, that I'd never had the chance to be the kind of daughter who could help her parents with a bad month, and that maybe this was simply what that felt like, 20 years late but not disqualified for lateness. It was my mother's questions that shifted first, before the requests did. She started asking gently, almost sleepily, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, whether Walton had ever mentioned putting anything aside for me. Not for himself, she was always careful to say. She wasn't asking for herself, she just worried, as a mother, whether I was being taken care of the way I deserved. She asked whether he had children of his own, whether there were other relatives who might have expectations. She asked, once, whether I'd ever seen his will, in a tone so carefully casual that I remember noticing the effort behind it before I noticed the question itself. My mother began mentioning, in that same specific offhand way people mention things they've rehearsed, how strange it was that some old man in rags had raised a daughter into someone who owned a whole company, when he himself, she'd heard, didn't seem to have 2 dimes to rub together. Does he even have insurance, Renee? She asked me once, over pot roast, not looking up from her plate. A man his age, alone in that house. What happens to all of it, whatever there is, when something happens to him? I set my fork down on the edge of my plate, tines aligned with the rim, and I said, I don't know, Mom. I've never asked him. That was true. I hadn't. It had never once occurred to me to ask, because I had never once, in 21 years, thought of Walton Calloway as a man with an all of it to leave anyone. I should tell you now, since you're a smarter audience than I was that year, that the black car that used to idle outside our house when I was a kid belonged to the board of Calloway Industries, the largest privately held construction and real estate holding company in the state, steel fabrication to logistics to half the skyline going up along the river, and that Walton Calloway was not a handyman who did odd jobs. Walton Calloway was the man who had built that company from a single fabrication shop in 1974, who had never remarried after his wife died young, who had no other children, and who had spent the last 30 years of his life wearing a canvas coat with his late wife's initials sewn into the lining, because she was the one who'd stitched them there, and because he had decided, somewhere in his grief, that a man who dressed like he had nothing would find out who actually loved him. I didn't know that yet either, not fully, not with numbers attached. But I was about to. The woman who helped me find out was my Aunt Faye, Walton's younger sister, though Aunt undersold what she was to me. Faye Calloway Hutchins was 71, ran a bookkeeping business out of her home in Lakewood, and had been the only member of Walton's family who ever fully approved of what her brother did the day he brought home an 8-year-old girl with a grease-stained collar. She'd taught me to keep books before I could drive a car. She noticed things. It was Faye who called me on a Tuesday in March, keeping her voice level in a way I'd learned to recognize as her being furious. Renee, honey, I need you to come by. Bring your laptop. At her kitchen table, she laid it out for me the way she laid out any ledger, plainly in order with dates. Ray Pruitt had, for months earlier, opened a small claims filing against a former employer over unpaid wages. A filing that, buried in its exhibits, listed his home address as a P.O. box in a different suburb than the one where he supposedly lived with my mother. Faye had pulled it because she'd gotten curious after my mother, at a dinner Faye had been invited to as family, had asked, casually, over dessert, whether Walton had ever formalized my adoption, or whether, legally speaking, I was still, in the eyes of the state, a Pruitt. That's not a question people ask over pie, Renee, Faye said. That's a question a lawyer asks. She'd found more. A judgment against my father from 11 years back. Gambling debt, $6,000, still not fully satisfied. A second, more recent one, smaller, same cause. A folder of clippings my mother had been keeping. Printed articles about Calloway Industries' upcoming riverfront development, one with a photograph of Walton from a groundbreaking he'd been dragged to and hated, a rare public appearance, his face barely visible under a hard hat, but his name in the caption, Walton Calloway, founder. She's had this since January, Faye said, tapping the date stamp on the printed article. Before she asked you about the insurance. Before she asked about the will. I sat with that for a long moment. I remember Faye's kitchen clock ticking, and the smell of her coffee, and how my hands were completely still on the table, because I had learned a long time ago, at that other table on Fenmore Street, that stillness was armor. They know, I said. They've known for months, Faye said. I think the reconciliation started the week after that groundbreaking ran in the paper, Renee. I checked the date. She'd gone further than I expected, and further than I'd have thought to go myself, because I still hadn't wanted to see it. She'd pulled the public court index and found that my father had filed for that small claims wage dispute using a different attorney than the one he'd used for his gambling judgment 11 years earlier. A small, sharp-eyed detail, because the attorney he'd hired this time specialized, according to his own firm website, in estate contests and heirship disputes. Not wage theft. Not really. Faye had called the man's office pretending to be a prospective client, and his paralegal, without much prompting, had confirmed that yes, they did occasionally take on cases involving informal or unrecorded custody transfers where a biological parent believed they retained a financial interest in a child's later estate, cases, the paralegal said, that had become more common than you'd think, once informal adoptions started intersecting with real money. He's not suing an old employer, Renee, Faye said. That filing is practice. He's finding out whether a lawyer thinks you and your father have a case worth building. And near as I can tell, the lawyer told him yes. She slid one more page across the table, a printed email, forwarded to her by mistake, she admitted, by a mutual acquaintance from the old neighborhood who still had my mother on a group thread from church and hadn't realized what she was passing along. In it, my mother had written, to a woman I didn't recognize, dated the previous November. We're getting close again with Renee, finally, thank God. I know it looks fast, but honestly Ray and I have been patient a long time. That man took her practically for nothing, and now look. She owes us that at least, don't you think, after everything we went through losing her. I read it twice. The first time for what it said. The second time, the way Walton taught me, for what it didn't say, which was any mention anywhere of missing me. I need you to understand something, Faye said, more gently than she'd said anything else that afternoon. I'm not telling you this to make you stop loving your parents. You can love people and still refuse to be their retirement plan. Those aren't in conflict, honey. My brother taught you that with his whole life. He's just never had to say it about himself. I want to be honest about what that did to me, because the version of this story where I feel nothing would be a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't lie about the parts that hurt. It didn't feel like anger, not at first. It felt like the floor tilting 2 degrees, small enough that you could still stand on it, but enough that you noticed every step after that. Before I tell you what happened next, comment below and let me know which city or country you're watching this from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story hits even harder than this one. For a while, I did nothing. That's not strategy. I want to be clear, it wasn't strategy at first. It was just paralysis dressed up as patience. I kept having Sunday dinners at the Pruitts. I kept my face arranged the same way. I watched my mother's hands when she talked about Walton's health, watched for the tell, and I found it. She always steered the conversation toward his age, his solitude, whether he had people looking out for him, in a voice that was trying to sound like concern and mostly sounded like inventory. Then, in May, Walton had a stroke. It was mild, the doctors said, mild being a relative word when it's someone you've had coffee with every morning for 22 years. I got the call from his housekeeper Marta, at 6:40 in the morning, 40 minutes after our coffee time, because he hadn't come down to make it, and she'd gone up and found him on the bathroom floor, conscious, scared, unable to get his left hand to close around anything. I drove to the hospital so fast I don't remember the drive. He was stable by the time I got there, slurring a little, embarrassed more than frightened, gripping my hand with his good one and saying, "Don't fuss," which from Walton was as close as he ever came to saying he was glad I'd come. My mother showed up at the hospital 11 hours later. I hadn't told her. I've never figured out to this day who did. A nurse who recognized the name from the news, maybe, or someone at Callaway Industries who didn't yet know to be careful. She came in with a container of soup she said she'd made, though I happened to know the container was from the grocery store 2 blocks from the hospital, still bearing the sticker price on the bottom, and she said, standing at the foot of Walton's bed while he dozed under sedation, It's just so hard to see him like this. All alone all these years. Someone should really be looking after his affairs. I didn't answer her in the room. I walked her to the elevator, and I said very quietly, "I am looking after his affairs, Mom. I have been my whole life. That's what he raised me to do." She smiled at me in a way I didn't like, small and satisfied, like I'd confirmed something for her rather than warned her off, and she said, "Good. Family should. That's all I'm saying." And the elevator doors closed. 2 days later, the scare came, the one that nearly undid everything. Faye called me at the office, voice tight in a way I'd only heard from her once before, the day of the stroke itself. A document had been filed with a downstate notary, not in Cuyahoga County, deliberately, somewhere they thought no one would think to look. A durable power of attorney form, purporting to grant Ray Pruitt authority over Walton Calloway's medical and financial decisions, citing Walton's diminished capacity following his hospitalization, with a signature at the bottom that was, according to the hospital's own attending physician when Faye showed it to him, dated for a day Walton had, in fact, been sedated and physically incapable of holding a pen steady enough to sign anything, let alone the looping, confident signature on that page. It hadn't gone through yet. It was sitting, pending, at a bank where Walton had a smaller personal account. Not the corporate accounts, those were untouchable, locked behind boards and trustees Ray Pruitt had never heard of, but a personal checking account with $11,000 in it, and, more dangerously, sitting behind a door that the forged POA, if it processed, would also open onto medical decision-making authority for a man who had just had a stroke. I remember standing in my own office with that document on the screen in front of me, and I remember my hands were not still this time. I remember setting my phone down on the desk, face down, very deliberately, the way you set something down when you don't trust what you'll do if you keep holding it. The document itself, when I finally made myself read the whole thing rather than just the signature line, was almost impressive in its ordinariness. The kind of form you could download from any legal template site, filled in with careful, unremarkable language, granting Ray Pruitt authority over financial affairs, banking transactions, and medical decision-making for Walton Calloway, in the event of incapacity, with a notary stamp from a small storefront office 2 counties south that, Faye discovered with one phone call, had no record of Walton ever having set foot in it. The notary, when Constance's paralegal reached her directly, remembered my father clearly, remembered him coming in alone, remembered him saying the principal hadn't been able to travel due to his condition, remembered stamping a document she'd been told, falsely, had already been witnessed and signed off-site. She hadn't known she was breaking any law. She just wanted to help a worried son get his elderly father's affairs in order, which was exactly the story my father had told her, word for word, according to her intake notes. Then I called our family attorney, Walton's attorney technically, a woman named Constance Reyes who had drafted every piece of paper Walton Calloway had ever signed for 30 years, and I said 4 words. "I need the trust." Here is the part of this story I'm proudest of, and it's the least dramatic part, and I think that's exactly why I'm proud of it. I didn't call my mother screaming. I didn't drive to Palmer and pound on a door. I didn't post anything online, didn't hire anyone to intimidate anyone, didn't do a single thing that would have felt, in the moment, as satisfying as rage would have felt. I did paperwork. Constance and I spent 4 days, Walton conscious now, weak but lucid, signing what needed his real signature under a notary Constance brought to his hospital room, with 2 nurses as independent witnesses to his competence, time-stamped and photographed, moving every share of Calloway Industries that Walton personally held into an irrevocable trust, with me named sole trustee, effective immediately, superseding any power of attorney claim by anyone, past, present, or future, unrelated to him. By blood or by law. We flagged the fraudulent downstate filing with the bank's fraud division and with the notary licensing board, quietly, through counsel, no press. We closed the personal checking account entirely and opened a new one that no one outside 3 people knew the number to. Faye and I sat down and calmly, without a single raised voice, terminated the lease on the small rental house Walton, through my recommendation months earlier, before I knew any of this, had been quietly paying half the rent on for Ray and Donna Pruitt as a family courtesy. I'd asked him for back when I still believed in the reconciliation. I signed the termination notice myself. 30 days. The Pruitts didn't know any of this had happened. That's the part one want you to sit with, because it's the whole shape of what I'd learned from Walton over 22 years of 5 a.m. coffee. You don't warn a person before you find the weak point in their plan. You find it quietly, and you reinforce your own structure, and you let the failure happen on its own schedule. Their schedule, it turned out, was the riverfront tower opening. Which brings us back to the tent, and the string quartet, and the $50 pressed into my hand. Walton had recovered enough, against every doctor's mild objection, to insist on being there. In a wheelchair, in a suit for once instead of the canvas coat, though Marta told me he'd made her bring the coat too, folded on his lap under a blanket. For luck, he said, which from Walton was practically poetry. He'd asked, 2 weeks earlier, quietly, in his hospital room, whether I would take over as CEO of Callaway Industries when the transition was formalized. I'd said yes before he finished the sentence. I hadn't told my parents any of that. I hadn't told them about the trust, or the fraud report, or the lease. As far as Donna and Ray Pruitt knew, walking into that tent in their good clothes, I was still their daughter with a nice engineering firm, and Walton Callaway was still some sentimental old eccentric they could outlawyer eventually, once he was gone. My mother had clearly had 2 glasses of champagne by the time she found me near the dessert table. My father hung back near the tent flap, the way he always did, letting her go first into rooms he wasn't sure of. "Renee," she said, too bright. "This is really something. All this, for you." "For the building," I said. She glanced around at the crowd, the caterers, the banner with my name on it. My full name, Renee Callaway, the name Walton had given me the legal right to when I was 19, the adoption finalized quietly in a courtroom with just the 2 of us and Faye, and something in her face shifted, hardened, like she decided this was the moment to spend whatever leverage she thought she still had. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about everything. About what we're owed, your father and I, for everything we went through. Giving you up like that. It cost us." "It cost you $50, I said. "I remember the number." That's when she said it, the line I opened this whole story with, loud enough that a few nearby guests turned, a wine glass paused halfway to someone's mouth. "That's $50. That's what you were worth to us. Don't stand there in that fancy coat acting like you were ever worth more. I want to tell you what I did, because it wasn't a scene, not the way she wanted it to be." I set my coffee mug down on the linen tablecloth. I looked at her, not away, not down, just steady, and I said, "Okay." Then I turned and I raised my hand, and Constance Reyes, who had been standing near the stage with a folder under her arm for exactly this possibility because I am, if nothing else, a woman who plans for load-bearing failures, walked over and handed it to me. "Mom, Dad," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised even me. "There's something you should probably know, since you clearly did some homework of your own. 6 days from now, I'm going to be announced publicly as the new CEO of Callaway Industries. Walton signed the paperwork 2 weeks ago. Everything he owns, the trust, the shares, the company, has been mine legally, irrevocably, since May. Not because I asked for it. Because he decided, a long time before either of you decided to find me again, that I was worth more than $50. My mother's face did something complicated, the champagne brightness draining out of it fast, replaced by something closer to arithmetic, like she was recalculating everything in real time. "You could have told us," she said, quieter now, aware of the guests around us in a way she hadn't been a minute earlier. "I could have," I agreed. "But you spent the last 8 months trying to get power of attorney over a man who raised me for free, off a forged signature, while he was in a hospital bed. Faye has the filing. The bank has the filing. So does the notary board." I set the folder down next to my mug, unopened, because I didn't need to open it. I needed her to know it existed. "You don't have to worry about the lease anymore either. It ends in 30 days. I already handled it." A few of the guests nearest us had gone quiet enough that I could hear the quartet again, mid-phrase, oblivious. Someone I recognized as a business reporter from the local paper had drifted 2 steps closer, phone lowered but not put away, and I remember thinking, with a strange calm that comes after you've already done the hard part in private, that it didn't matter. There was nothing left in that folder, or in that moment, that I was ashamed to have witnessed. My father hadn't said a word this whole time. He was looking at Walton, across the tent, in his wheelchair, coat folded on his lap, watching us without expression, the way he'd watched everything his whole life, reading the room slowly, patiently, the way he'd taught me to read a set of blueprints. "We're your parents," my father said finally, low. "You were," I said. "For 8 years. He's been my father for 22. I picked my mug back up. It was empty by then, had been empty the whole time, but it felt right to be holding it. "I hope you get somewhere good, both of you. I mean that. But I'm not the $50 anymore, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life letting you collect on it." I didn't wait to watch them leave. I walked back across the tent to Walton, and I crouched down next to his wheelchair, and he looked at me with that slow-moving gaze of his, and he said, "Well," which from him meant a great deal. "Well," I agreed. Walton lived 4 more years after that night. Long enough to see the trust structure hold, long enough to see Callaway Industries finish the riverfront project, long enough for me to fully step into the role he'd spent 2 decades quietly building me toward without either of us calling it that out loud. In that time, the company grew past anything either of us said aloud we expected, and I learned to sit in rooms full of men twice my age who'd known Walton for decades and watch their surprise settle, slowly, into something closer to respect, the same way his hardware store clerk's care in his voice had settled into me as a child before I understood what it meant. I kept the firm running too, smaller, separate, because Walton had taught me never to let one structure be the only thing holding up your life, and some of my proudest work is still stamped with my own name and nobody else's. He died on a Tuesday, the way he'd arrived in my life on a Tuesday, in his own bed, in the same narrow house on the west side, with Faye and me both there, and the coat with the gold WC stitched inside the lining folded on the chair beside him, because he'd asked for it to be close, and I never did learn who else besides his late wife had known that habit of his. I still live not far from that house. I kept it, in the end, rather than sell it, turned the front room into an office, left the kitchen almost exactly as it was, because some rooms don't need improving, they need preserving. Some mornings, when the calendar allows it, and I've built my calendar, deliberately, to allow it. More than it used to, I get up at 5 before the sun, and I make coffee in a percolator that hisses like a kettle, and I pour it into a chipped ceramic mug with a grease-thin crack near the handle that I've never let anyone throw away, not once, not in 26 years. I sit at that same small table for 2, though I usually sit alone now, and some mornings I bring one of the younger engineers from the firm through a set of drawings the way Walton once brought me, tapping a pencil against a beam and asking them to find where it wants to fail before I tell them. I watch their faces do what mine must have done at 12, that slow click of understanding that a person can love you by teaching you to see clearly, without ever once saying the word. I never heard from my parents again after that night under the tent, not directly. Faye tells me occasionally secondhand that they moved out of state a few years back. Arizona, she thinks, though she's careful never to sound too certain, the way you're careful not to hand someone a door back into a room they've already left. I don't ask for details. It isn't bitterness, not anymore. It's just that some doors, once you've closed them properly, don't need to be checked again. There's a particular kind of peace in that I didn't expect. Not triumph, nothing so loud as triumph, just the quiet, structural certainty of a wall that's been correctly load-tested and will hold. People ask me, sometimes, whether I forgive them. I've stopped trying to give that question a clean answer, because I don't think it has one. What I know is this. I was worth $50 to 2 people who were supposed to love me for free, and I built, out of that fact, a life that owes nobody an explanation for existing. I was never the $50. I never needed anyone else to tell me that. I just needed enough quiet mornings to hear myself say it first.